Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, The Neighborhood Remembers. The Neighborhood Punishes. I decided it's finally time to let the world know what happened to a sociopath who dared to cross the neighborhood. To set the stage, I used to live in a big but not huge city, let's call it Palmville. I lived near the corner of a dense suburb nestled between overstuffed apartment buildings, a river that smelled like diesel when at low tide, and two busy highways. I was a minority in this neighborhood and I caught a lot of heat for it. People didn't really like white people there, but enough of our neighbors were accepting of us that aside from a few disagreements between families and the beatings that came with them, I didn't feel like I was in danger when leaving my home. It was a rough neighborhood, but it was my home, and it protected its own. The community center was like a temple, and, let's call her AM, was the priestess. In our neighborhood she was respected like a living deity, and her calm and understanding reflected her status. I never once saw her behave without a strong moral code. And the final piece to set this stage, our former landlord. Short Asian lady in all the stereotypical ways, kind and sweet. Our house was above my parents' pay grade and she knew it. She went out of her way to find house repair and maintenance jobs for tenants that were having money problems. She'd pay them by taking chunks out of their rent, oftentimes a bit larger than how much the work they did was worth. Looking back, that was probably illegal, but that's irrelevant because she died. The circumstances surrounding her death were suspect, but none of the suspects play a part in this story, so there's no need to go into detail on it. Her sons, who wanted nothing to do with real estate, took over the business. They couldn't make heads or tails of how she managed to float books with so much red in them and began dumping properties. Ours was on that list. I harbor no ill will towards them, and still wish them the best, but the guy who bought the house, enter the sociopath and today's victim. This guy wasted no time in making our lives hell. His first action was to raise the rent. Apparently when the account changed hands, he was allowed to update the rent to modern pricing. We'd been there for several years and were paying below market even from the onset, so this was a huge blow by itself. The second blow came when he said that the rent had to be ready, in full, on the 1st of every month, no partial payments, no work to reduce it, no extensions. Full rent on the 1st of the month or an eviction notice on the 2nd. This was hemorrhaging our savings, but we were surviving for the moment. Meanwhile, AM had lobbied hard for the city to co-fund a revival project to renovate the entire aging suburb, and she succeeded. One street at a time had conga lines of work trucks almost every day, and people were getting old leaky pipes replaced, sinkholes in yards patched, fences repaired, paint renewed. It was an amazing thing, and an enticing thing for the sociopath. Being at the corner of the neighborhood, our house was on the last street on the list, and sociopath wanted us out so he could relist the house after renovation. He never said this directly, but multiple conversations made his intent clear even for 10-year-old me. Random inspections, overhyping of minor problems with the house, even so far as trying to bring us up on completely false animal abuse charges because our cat was attacked by what we believe was a raccoon and he tried to claim we did it, yeah, because a vet can't figure out the difference between knife wounds and a mauling. We read the writing on the wall and began preparations to move. We decided to move in with my oldest brother in a place I'll call Banjoland. Most of us had moved except my other brother, who stayed behind because he still had a lot of social ties in Palmville, and his new job meant if he cut corners, he could keep paying sociopaths inflated bills. Well, despite his best efforts, he came up $20 short 1 month and sociopath jumped on it. He had 30 days. We made the 400-mile trip from Banjoland to Palmville to get the rest of our stuff, and I can't say as I approved of my brother's living conditions, but I guess that's beside the point. The month passed rather uneventfully. I guess sociopath figured he'd won, so there was no need to burn the gas to drive out and gloat. The neighborhood had learned what was going on, and that was the first time I'd ever been back in that neighborhood where I didn't get a single call out, a single glare, a single racist remark. Everybody behaved reverently. It was kind of disturbing in all honesty. I guess people in lower incomes all know what eviction means and felt like I was having a bad enough time already. Well, 20 days later he says it's time to leave. We still had a week left, but it didn't matter, we didn't have the money to try fighting it with a lawyer. AM descended from the heavens and bought us a couple extra days, but it was evident he really wanted us out, possibly because the work trucks were now one street away. The last time I ever saw the house I grew up in, workmen were throwing my childhood possessions into a large bin when we supposedly still had 3 days left to leave. Everything that follows is a collection of information I got through the grapevine and phone calls with people present at the events. Immediately, sociopath moved into the house himself. Why, you may ask? People who owned the homes they were living in were getting the full cost of renovations comped by the city. He figured that by moving in himself, he'd be able to get this house he bought at liquidation price renovated for free and flip it. AM was having none of it. She explained to him that at the time the revival project was approved, that house was a rental lot, and they can't change the budget now. She then explained to him that the partial cost coverage that had been approved for the lot was in our name, not his, and he wasn't eligible for partial cost comping either. He'd have to pay every penny himself, and since the entire neighborhood was getting a facelift, he was required to at least renovate the exterior, otherwise she'd see the house condemned as an eyesore or dilapidated or whatever the legal term is. He went really cheap on the renovations, basically put in new carpets and a coat of paint. This would later come to bite him in the butt. He then began trying to sell the house in earnest. The neighborhood remembered what he'd done. There were vandalisms when nobody was there, and loud noises from the neighbors when people were there to look the house over, and anytime a prospective buyer asked around, they got the full stink eye from anybody they talked to. They made sure he simply couldn't get that house sold at market value. After 3 months of this, he lowered the listing price. Then a month later he lowered it again and finally got a bite. AM personally made sure he had to file every single piece of paperwork before it changed hands. Every single part of the house had to be inspected thoroughly. And that's when Karma herself caught up with him. In his hasty and cheap renovations, he'd somehow damaged the pipes. Black mold. AM remembered how he'd treated us and she decided to pay him back in kind. I never heard how exactly she pulled it off, but she managed to delay him getting the news about the black mold being discovered for several days, long enough that by time he did get the news he didn't have enough time left to try getting it cleaned or make a last-ditch effort to save the house. The house was condemned days later. In their final act, AM and members of the neighborhood filed every single complaint and injunction they could and arranged for him to be compelled by the city to demolish the house immediately. A cost he had to pay out of his own pocket. He tried to destroy a family and broke laws just to make some quick cash, and instead was left fighting a year-long legal battle and ended up losing thousands. The neighborhood remembers. The neighborhood punishes. The next one is titled, Neighbor Tells Me No Smoking in the Toilet. So I moved places a few months ago. I live on the top floor of a 5-story building, and the subject of my revenge lives on the first floor, directly below me. I rent the place and according to the contract I cannot smoke in the house. Not even on the balcony. I'm fine with it, so I drag my butt down to the street and smoke there. No biggie. It all started on my 3rd day in my new little home. I went down to smoke, and while enjoying my precious cancer stick, this old lady, BN as in witchy neighbor, on the 1st floor's balcony emerged. BN, excuse me, but I would like you to stop smoking in the toilet. Me, confused, why would I do that? BN, I don't know, but every night we wake up from cigarette smoke, and we would appreciate if you would stop it. Me, I never smoke in the house, much less in the toilet. That's why I'm smoking right here. BN, I hope so. I never want it to happen again. Me, sure. And for a few days I thought nothing of it. She is probably retired, bored, whatever. I never smoked in the house, never will. I tried being as nice as possible, not wanting to have fights with my neighbors on the first day. I even thought she might have smelled it because I was smoking in the door of the building, and her window was above it, so I even crossed the street, so it wouldn't be a problem later. And with it I thought it's over. But approximately a week later, she caught me, while smoking. I won't write the conversation out. Pretty much, she told me again to stop smoking in the toilet. I tried to reason with her saying, why would I come down and climb those monstrous stairs if I just smoke in the house? And even if I smoked in the house, why would I do it in the toilet? Why not the balcony? And I also questioned how could the smoke go all the way down to the first floor. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe ventilation is made so air goes towards the top of the building. In the end we both were pretty upset, and she said she will come knocking every time she smelled it. I was like, yeah sure. Then a week later she did come knocking. At 2 a.m. when I was sleeping. I was upset, sent her to hell, then shut the door. The very next day, she did it again. Around the same time. And this continued for a few weeks, but not every day. So we come to the revenge part. Sorry the exposition took so long. My friend suggested a very good thing. What if I knock on her door every time I go smoking, just to ensure her that I don't smoke in the toilet? And I did exactly that. For 3 days straight, every single time I had the urge to smoke. Which meant something like 5 to 6 cans a stick. Outside work hours of course. I smoke much more at work, I can tell you. She was upset. She shouted, threatened me, but all I did was making sure there is no misunderstanding from either part. But well, all fun had to stop. And it stopped when she called the police on me. They were really understanding, but obviously not approved of my actions. But now there is no knocking on my door at any time. And no, I don't know where the smoke could come from. From all I know, there are 2 people besides me, who smokes on the street, where I do it as well. So that is the question of the century. The next one is titled, The Friendly Next Door. 2 summers ago my family was blessed with a nice family moving in next door to us. The husband and wife, let's call them Chris and Rachel, have 2 young neighbors, 8 and 10 when they moved in, and our families were instant friends. Being away from home, I was always greeted by the children and had a good relationship with both of the parents. Our 2 houses were inseparable, rarely did days go by where we did not see each other. Boy can things change on a dime. The neighbors still had possession of their previous home, which they were renting to another family, and Rachel was always the one in charge of the mortgages and general finances. Slightly after a year and a half of living in the new house, Chris was very surprised to learn that the house they were renting was foreclosed on. After what I can only assume was an aggressive argument, the husband was kicked out and moved in with his friend. Don't be too worried about Rachel being a single mother though, as it didn't even take a week before the man she was having an affair with another close neighbor and his 3 kids. It is unknown how long they were together, but it's been at least 6 months. Since the wife knew my family was not on her side, she immediately cut contact, not even letting the kids say hi to me when I was in town. Most of the next several months were not very eventful to the story, but does explain why things are the way they are. The husband never pushed for anything in court because he was scared of what would happen to him if he pushed for custody, money, etc. Rachel was physically abusive and has some shady connections. When living together, the wife and her boyfriend had many physical altercations to the point where DCFS did not allow the kids to live there. The children come back and the boyfriend is no longer legally able to live with Rachel, however, he just decides to stay and rarely is seen on the property. One day, my sister, 18, and her boyfriend at the time were arguing on the front lawn and the neighbor decides to step in, probably a dumb move by my sis but whatever. Within seconds of the hag crossing the property line, my mother, Nan, was there to have her daughters back. Nan, what are you doing here? You have no right to talk to my daughter like this. Rachel, you need to learn how to properly parent your kids. Your duck-up daughter is making a scene. While Nan started to turn away to walk inside, thinking this stupid argument was over, she was stopped by Rachel pulling her by her hair. Once Nan was turned around, she was greeted her with a fist to the face, leaving a puffy purple lip for weeks. Somebody walking nearby alerted the police, who, knowing the address, promptly arrived at the scene. Unfortunately, since Rachel had friends who swore Nan threw a punch at her too, all charges were dropped. When Nan went to work the next day, she worked at the elementary school. Rachel's older kid sparked a conversation with Nan about her lip. That was all it took for Rachel to have her chance, as she complained to the school that an employee was talking to my child about private affairs. Due to Nan's good standing, her boss decided to move her to another school instead of any disciplinary action. Rachel still believes she successfully got Nan fired. Time passes, and soon enough, the boyfriend's probationary period is up and he is allowed to move back in. The day after the douchebag is officially living there again, guess who has to be called to the house? Knowing that another police intervention would have him kicked out again, the boyfriend leaves before the police arrive. In order to cover her trail, Rachel used her child's phone to text DCFS, "Help, Daddy is beating up Mommy." Police immediately arrest Chris and hold him overnight, as he had been at home and had no alibi. Rachel then used this instance to obtain an order of protection against Chris. In case you are unaware, an order of protection is basically a restraining order that is granted faster. In order to protect his friend from his demon wife, Chris's roommate installed security cameras around their house, recording all data of persons entering or leaving the property. While installing the cameras, the friend crafted a master plan to help Chris in his time of need. One security camera was not installed on that house, as it could be used for a much better purpose. My family owns a tow-behind camper, which sits on the side of the driveway near the neighbors and has a window with perfect vision over their driveway. Note, it is 100% legal in Illinois to install a security camera looking, not listening, at somebody's property as long as it is installed on your own. 3 days pass, another false allegation arises from Rachel. This time, apparently Chris had broken into her house and forced her to give him oral sex. After reviewing the footage of the house, Chris never left, and the video footage of him sleeping at that time, yes, he started recording himself sleeping. The detectives were quick to realize who the real antagonist of the case was. It was at this time that the detectives became aware of the camera on my neighbor's house. 2 more accusations came from the lying witch the next week, both of which the detectives looked into without much surprise from the outcome. Several days later, the husband and his friend meet with Rachel and her boyfriend at their court date. Not only is Rachel continuing to push false accusations, her boyfriend decided that it would be a good idea to follow them up with threatening glances and whispering threats. Once the court session moves forward, the tables turn, and the detectives announce that they are no longer looking at the husband, but Rachel for accusing him of crimes that never occurred. Rachel hears this and immediately leaves the courtroom with her boyfriend. After hearing of this surprise, the neighbors finally went home to see why their world was crashing around them. The security camera 10 feet away from their parked cars. The last one is titled, "Annoying Neighbor." An equals annoying neighbor MB equals Melbourne water guy. So, just for a bit of context, my mum and dad own a plant nursery. From what I was told, Aaron was a retired lawyer with too much time on his hands, and he lived just down the hill from us and owned a dam as well. So let's get into this, for it is long. So, his happened back a few years ago, when I was in year 11 of my high school, about mid-autumn. Keep in mind this is Australia, so it is bloody dry. We get a formal complaint from Aaron. This isn't a big shock because at this stage we were getting formal complaints from him every 2 weeks or so, anything from too much noise, to yes too little of noise, our dog, our hill eroding, anything this guy could think of. It came in his usual lawyer-styled letters. Anyway, this guy had written us a letter claiming we had infected his water with blue-green algae, and we would have to pay all damages to his property, including vet bills for his horses. Now my mum and dad were furious with this guy, for when we were having our dam built, this guy kept complaining about how the runoff from our pots would change the nutrient level in the water, so when dad built this he went all out. He had a natural filtration system with 2 smaller dams that all water would go through first, filled with natural water filter plants, reeds and other plants. Then it would go through a chlorinator, and finally a pumped filter. Every month Dad would backwash mains into the dam to keep the dam the right pH, and pump the water constantly to keep it aerated. So my parents replied a flat no. So, our neighbor makes his biggest mistake and calls Melbourne Water to look at our dam and to test the water, and guess who had to pay for the water testing fee? So MB gets there and is quite upset, for his coworker called in sick and he is going have to collect water samples from all water inflows and overflows and the dam itself by himself, do salinity tests, pH tests and send samples back to the lab for further testing. I thought it was interesting for I was doing chemistry at the time, so I went out to talk to him about it. He looks at our setup, and to say the least, was pretty impressed. He asks why it was getting reviewed 1. Due to how dry it is and how water isn't overflowing from our dam to his, and 2. Why it is the neighbor getting reviewed due to he is the one with blue-green algae. He soon gets explained all the crap our neighbor gives us, and expresses his sympathy. When he is about to finish up, he suddenly asks about the fence line that goes through the AN's dam, and I tell him about how a few years back the neighbor had told us to reinstall our connecting fence in order to keep our dog in, and how Dad had to pay for it all. Dad was upset and decided to review over our property border, and didn't give up a centimeter of land to this guy even if it went through his dam. Now Melbourne Water smiles and says, "Well, I'll have to get a sample of that as well, won't I, since it is your water." After this he talks to my parents about our options and says that the review will be scheduled soon about the water contamination. By the way, I was not present for the meeting. Mum and Dad relayed the whole thing to me. Anyway, going on. So about a month later, the council has us sit down for a meeting with him there, and all he knew was it was about contamination of water, and he is looking smug. Then it starts. MB goes on to state that the contamination did not come from our dam and likely came from an horse poo runoff into his dam, but without further testing on AN's property, there would be no conclusive evidence. And just looks confused because why have a council meeting for this, but MB isn't done yet. He then goes to state that there has been, in fact, contamination to our water from his, as we have a cubic meter of water coming across from his dam. I heard he just went pale as he realized what this meant for him. He would have to pay us for damage. He quickly got composure and claimed that we do not use the cubic meter of water and therefore do not have damage. It was my mum's turn now. She got up and told the council she wanted to use this water for a water exhibit for our plants range for when customers came over to look at our plants, but could not do so with the water contaminated. The council had already seen the plans and agreed. So the AN was then forced to pay for Melbourne Water to come out and determine where the contamination was, and then set up a filtration system similar to ours, which cost Dad about $20,000 to decontaminate the water so we could do our water garden. Thanks for listening.